Okay, let's get started. So, welcome to the February Lunch and Learn that the Midwest Grape and Wine Industry Institute puts on. Today, we're really fortunate to have Randall Vos join us, our colleague here at ISU Extension. Um, and I'm very thankful that he's here because I know Randall is busy in the months of January and February on the conference circuit, so you may see him elsewhere. But I think he's going to give us a great talk today on something that's, if you haven't started, maybe at least you're thinking about starting your pruning, and maybe he'll give you some things to think about while you're in the vineyard. So as always, just a reminder, we do record the presentation part of these lunch and learns and post them on our YouTube channel. We do not record or we do not post any of the discussion afterwards, so that you can feel free to ask questions kind of freely or comments. So with that, I will turn it over to Randall.
Well, good noon to everyone. So we're going to talk a little bit about pruning today. And, I'm not here to tell anyone how to prune their vineyard or anything like that, but I just wanted to share a couple things that, A, I've noticed, and B, I've had some plots where we've pruned some vines different ways. I just want to kind of share some of those numbers and so forth. So, we're going to get into a little bit on, basically what pruning can or can't do. And what things do impact yield? Does pruning impact yield? And if so, how? And then talk maybe about why it pays to count a little bit every now and then in terms of how many buds you're leaving on vines, and get into spur length as well. So I I'm going to put a few quotes in here of things I hear quite a bit of. And one thing I hear a lot of is cold hardy hybrid grapes are too vigorous. And sometimes I see that, sometimes I don't. And so, before we get into pruning, I just want to kind of talk about some general vine things just for a couple minutes here. And that's basically, if you look at how a grapevine grows, it's a balance. What we want is a balance between the amount of fruit produced, which is the grape cluster, the amount of foliage produced, and then that foliage grows the vine, so the trunk, the roots, and that kind of thing. And in a happy, perfect world, we have moderately vigorous shoots that go to the ground every year that stop growing, and we produce a commercial level of fruit. In a situation where we got really high vigor, it's probably a situation where we have lots and lots of leaves and we have too little fruit. And that's not an economical situation. And fruit quality probably goes down too, because we have too much shade on that fruit. And some people are in the other situation. They got a huge amount of fruit, very little foliage, and that creates problems as well. All those sugars are going towards that fruit. Very little is going to the vine, and that hurts it for future years. So, in an ideal world, we're somewhere in the middle, and that's hard to do. But if your vines are overly vigorous, I would maybe just ask the question, can you crop them heavier? And maybe pruning is a way to prune them differently might be a way to consider that. I show this picture a fair bit in presentations because to me, this is like an ideal high wire cord on vine. We're probably pulling 5 tons an acre in this situation. We got sunlight on the top, and we got tons of leaves with dappled sunlight, and that is effectively harvesting sugar, but yet it's also not creating too much shade. Again, not easy to achieve, but to me, this is kind of what our goal is. I know a lot of people like to have the shoots not reach the ground, and I get that. There are some negatives to that. But if we cut them too short or what have you, we're not harvesting sunlight, and we're not harvesting sugars, and that can create some issues as well. So again, we want to be in that middle situation. The top one is too much foliage, vines are too vigorous, and that gets us in a vicious cycle. If those canes are shaded too much in the growing season, they're going to have less fruit, not a lot of fruit the next year. And so it's a vicious cycle. But again, the other situation is lots of fruit, very few leaves. We can get poor quality, low sugar, low Brix fruit, more shot berries quite a bit as well. So here's a situation where the vines are way, way, way too vigorous. This is a vineyard that's pulling about 2 tons per acre. This is Marquette. And you can see those vines are giving every indication that they are undercropped. And that is not helping fruit quality. In some cases, low yield can equal good quality fruit. I would personally argue that in this situation, low yield is getting poor quality fruit because you can't see a single grape cluster in there because the canopy is just too dense. Here's the opposite. We got 2 huge clusters, and this is a few weeks before for raisin, and we have very few leaves on there. So that's the opposite situation. We don't want to be in that situation either. And pruning is a tool to kind of get us somewhere in that middle. So what does predict yield? Is it the number of buds we leave? Is it the pruning weights of these vines? And it's probably both. I'm just going to show you some numbers. I'm not claiming that these are going to be accurate in every situation, but there's a study done many years ago in Concord where they left vines with 20 buds, 40 buds, 80 buds, 120 buds, and 160 buds. And they looked at what was the actual yield. And so what I did is I assumed 40 buds per vine was normal. And so I looked at, okay, if you get X amount of fruit per bud, what would that be with 20 buds, 80 buds, 120, 160? And you can see the hypothetical yield is this as we increase our number of buds. But once you get above a certain point, we still increase yield, you bet. But not nearly as much as what we would expect, because grapevines are somewhat self-limiting. If we leave too many buds, they will, in theory, set fewer berries, maybe more shot berries and that kind of thing. That's the theory. I'm not claiming that it's always going to work out this way. I've seen situations where the actual yield is much closer to the hypothetical yield, but we want to be cognizant that yes, pruning does have an impact, and the number of buds we do does have an impact on yield, but other factors are at play here too, and that's the vines kind of self-regulating to some degree. So here's a situation. This is Frontenac. Probably could use a little bit more foliage on here, but we got some nice looking clusters. This is just after raisin, so some of these green berries are going to color up yet. And here's a severely overcropped Frontenac, and I didn't have a great picture of the whole vine. Lots of shot berries, very small straggly clusters. And so again, the vines can, to some degree, not 100%, but they can self-regulate a little bit. So keep that in mind. What about pruning weight? And I know very few of us actually do pruning weights, and I'm not suggesting everyone needs to weigh every vine or anything like that, but it might make sense to weigh a couple vines or so in your vineyard. So that would be all the canes you prune off a year. So this is a plot I had in La Crescent. And if you look, some of the vines had almost 3 pounds of pruning weights and some had a half a pound. And again, there's not a huge correlation between pruning weight and yield, but these are all pruned to 50 buds, and you can see the higher the pruning weights, the higher the yield for the most part. And so again, it's not super strong correlation because part of these is that they're pruned differently. But if I look at some other ones, this is just within the exact same way I pruned these. These were pruned to 50 buds, and they were pruned to 4-node canes to get us 50 buds. You can see, yeah, getting a higher pruning weight vine from the get-go is probably going to get us a higher yield regardless of how those vines are pruned. And so, not every variety or situation is going to respond like this, but here's another one from these same plots. So if we're starting out with low pruning weights, it's going to impact our yield. And so even if I leave more buds in a low pruning weight vine, we could be in trouble. And so those are just some things to consider. Is we do want vines that have a decent amount of pruning weight to get us a decent yield. So again, when we talk about pruning, everyone's situation is different. So do what works best for you. I'm going to talk a little bit about cane pruning here. I'm not suggesting you change over to that system. I'm just sharing with you information that we found when we did some cane pruning. I think one thing that we can all agree on, or hopefully we can all see when I show you here in a little bit, is when you do spur pruning, like most vines are in the Midwest, we don't want overly complex spurs. We want these spurs to be very simple spurs that don't look like a hand when we look at them. And then, if you are struggling with excessive vigor and you want to, up your yield to try and balance out these plants, maybe consider some of the options that I'm going to be sharing here. So this is a spur. So the cordon is over here. I lopped it off. This is what we don't want, and this is, nothing earth shattering here, but we don't need any of this ancillary stuff over here. Ideally in every spur location, we want one cane shortened to a spur with the correct number of buds we want. It's really hard from a pest management perspective, getting rough counts on our vines perspective, to A, it's a lot of work to shorten every single one of these little things, and B, now you're left in the situation where you probably do have to make some big cuts, which do kind of predispose our vines to more likely to get some of these trunk diseases. So again, we don't want to get to this point. Keep these spurs non-complex from the get-go. So, when I visit growers, I a lot of times I'll ask, so how many buds do you leave per vine? And a lot of the common answers I get is I leave about 2 nodes per spur location or 3 nodes per spur location. And again, that's not wrong. My question is always, well, how many spur locations do you have? And if that is a low number, the question is, are you leaving enough buds? And so I would suggest that maybe we look at it as, maybe we have a goal of a certain number of buds per vine, and then you decide how long the spurs are you leaving. Because as our cordons are aging, we're getting fewer and fewer of these spur locations. And if we're only leaving 2 buds per spur location or 3 buds per spur location or something like that, we're leaving fewer buds. And so my advice is to do some crude counting. Again, I don't think you got to count to the insane level of detail, but when I prune these plots, I did, but again, it goes pretty fast when you get a method, and I'll kind of go over that. So in this situation, we got tons of spur locations on this cordon. And so again, if I leave 2 node spurs, I'm going to have lots of buds, versus in this situation right here, this cordon's not doing great. We got some decent vigor here towards the yoke of that vine or the trunk, but as we get farther out, some of these are probably died back, and there's very few spur locations. And so again, if we just leave 2 per location or 3 per location or something like that, we're going to get a very different situation in terms of total number of buds from each of those pruning ways of looking at it. So like I mentioned, our cordons and many vines are kind of aging, and as these vines age, or the cordons age, we tend to lose some spur locations. And again, that's not ideal. We'd love to maintain all of them, but it happens. And so I'd maybe suggest is, if you're in that situation, instead of leaving 2 or 3 node spurs on everything, if you have fewer spur locations, maybe you need to leave longer spurs than 2 or 3 nodes to get that same bud count if your vines are vigorous. And so, if we're looking at a 8-foot vine's 8 feet apart, I got 20 spur locations, so 10 on each side of the cordon, and we're leaving 3 nodes per spurs, that's 60 buds. But as those vines get older and lose spur locations, if we're pruning the same way, so let's say we get down to 15 spur locations, and every location we're leaving a 3-node cane or 3-node spur, we're down to 45 buds. And so, it's going to impact our yield. And so I'd suggest having a strategy, maybe think about, if you have workers for you or something like that, how many spur locations do you have on an average plant? And then tell them to leave, okay, I'm just going to say it's 12 spur locations on each plant, and that's kind of a low number. If my goal is 50 buds or 40 buds or whatever your goal is, if I'm only leaving, and that should say 36, not 26 there, if I'm only leaving 3 buds per spur, again, you're probably not realizing the yield potential that you could have. And so that's one way to approach it. So let's say we have a vine that is vigorous, lots of spur locations are 8 feet apart. You know, there's some suggestions about leaving 4 to 6 nodes per foot is ideal. 4 to 6. And so I generally go on the high side of that, and that would be about 50 buds. And so we can go about it several different ways. You know, if I have 2 sides of that cordon, and each of those sides of that cordon has lots of spur locations, I could leave 8 3-node spurs, and I'll get my roughly 50 buds because I'm getting 24 there. And again, don't completely eliminate those spur locations you're not maybe using for fruiting canes. Leave a renewal spur so that next year you have some options. So a 1 bud spur. If you're getting to the point where you're having fewer spur locations, maybe you leave 6 4-node spurs, or even, an extreme case, and most people aren't going to probably do this, but if you leave 5 5-node spurs on each side of the cordon, if you're losing spur location. So want to consider adapting our spur length based on, as these vines are aging, it's a work to replace cordons. And so we might consider leaving fewer spurs but longer spurs before we get to the point of replacing those cordons, because that's real work. So does that matter? Is it just a numbers game? Am I going to get the same yield from leaving 25 2-node spurs as the 10 5-node spurs? And the answer to that is you're probably going to get different yields. And so let's say you're leaving 2-node spurs and you're not happy with your yield, or your vines are still overly vigorous and you don't want to add more shoots. So you want to leave 50 buds. I'm just using that as an example. Leaving longer spurs is generally going to get you a higher yield with the same number of buds, generally. Again, not always, but generally. So I'm going to share some numbers with you, some plots we had where we did that. So what I did on these buds, and these aren't great photos, or excuse me, these vines. Again, I pruned them all to 50 buds. Some I left, so it'd be 25 2-node spurs, and the appropriate number of 3-node, 4-node, 5-node spurs, again, to get 50 buds per vine total. So they're pruned the same 50 number of buds. And then I cane pruned some as well. So I left 4 long canes on each side. Again, I tried to leave roughly 12-node canes. Sometimes one was 10, one was 15. I was just trying to get 50 buds total on each side. And so these vines originally cordon trained with spur pruning. I just switched a few of them over to this cane pruning. So I did this with Brianna, La Crescent, Marquette, which are fairly common varieties in the Midwest. And so I'm just going to share some numbers, and then we'll kind of open it up to discussion after that. So we did this in 2023, 2024, and so the Brianna, we had cane pruning, 2-node spurs, 3-node spurs, and 5-node spurs. So we did that. And that year, so this is 2023, the average yield per vine was about 20 pounds. And so if we look, the 4 canes, we had above average yield. When we did 25 2-node spurs, we had below average yield. And if we did 3-node spurs or 5-node spurs, we were right on that average. Now, I'm not saying everyone go out and cane prune Brianna, because I don't know that I would, and I'll get into why. But we can see that leaving 2-node spurs got us a lower average yield per vine than leaving slightly longer spurs. I don't have good statistics for you and all that for this. I'm just going on averages here. So keep that in mind. 2022, we had similar yield, actually. We had around 22 pounds per vine. And the cane prune vines actually averaged to below average yield wise. And so we probably overcropped them that last year. And I got some other evidence to kind of show you that. The 2-node spurs, so again, 25 2-node spurs to get 50 buds, were actually again below average. And the 3-node, 5-node spurs were above average. And so again, if you're not happy with your yield and your vines are vigorous, and you're pruning to 2-node spurs, maybe consider increasing that spur length to, again, the same number of total buds, but slightly longer spurs, to consider increasing your yield a little bit if your vines can handle it. So I'm pretty sure that this 4-node canes, or excuse me, 4 canes, so cane pruning those long canes, overcrop these vines. And here's how I'll share those numbers. So if you look at those 2-node spurs, we had much higher bricks than that cane pruning. And so again, that's a good indicator that, hey, these cane pruned vines lagged way behind on sugar. And so they're probably overcropped. You can also look at, the 3 and 5 node 3 and 5 node spurs, they start to have lower sugar than the 2-node spurs one as well. And so, you could argue if bricks is your goal, a lower yield is always better. I mean, generally the lower you yield, the higher your bricks is going to be, but bricks does not always equate to quality when it comes to, open canopy and so forth. So there's always going to be drawbacks to getting a higher yield. One of those is a lower bricks. I do not have the fruit numbers from 2024, but my takeaway from this is I personally would not cane prune Brianna, even though it gave quite a bit higher yields. And what happened was when we cane pruned those, we laid down those canes, they had really nice shoots on the apical parts of those canes, but all the ones near the base basically died back. And so it was really hard to maintain this year after year. I only did it 2 years because all these shoots near the base of those canes died back. And so it was really hard to perpetuate this on Brianna when it did it 2 years. And again, maybe that was just the 2-year deal. But personally, I wouldn't cane prune Brianna just for that reason. 2-node canes had lower yields every year we did it, so just 2 years. And the 3 to 5 node canes were generally average to above average in terms of yield. And so if it were me, I would prune them something along the bottom 2 options, the 3 to 5 node canes, or 3 to 5 node spurs, excuse me, a few typos here. So we did the same thing with Marquette. Again, I have a few typos in here, my apologies. So 2023, we had a little issue with our machine harvester. And so I hand harvested about 10% of these vines. There are 50 vines in this plot. And so I didn't want to hand harvest all of them. So I hand harvested 10% of them. And if we look at that year, those Marquette averaged about 19 pounds per plant. And that cane pruning had above average yield. The 5 node spurs were average yield, and 2 to 3 node spurs were below average yield. So we did in 20, again, I don't trust these numbers completely because it was a small number of vines. But again, the machine harvesting was done about a week apart on some of these rows, so I couldn't really use those numbers. On the right-hand side is 2024, not 2023 like the slide says, and those weren't estimates. They're actually machine harvested. And we got a little bit lower yield, about 17 pounds. And again, the cane prune vines were above average. The 5 node spurs were above average. The 3 node spurs were average, and the 2 node spurs were below average. So again, these 2 node spurs in both years gave us a below average yield on the same number of buds compared to other pruning types. So again, something to consider. So I'm not suggesting you cane prune Marquette, but there were some positives to that I didn't take a good picture of. And that is, cane pruning, Marquette gets a lot of these shoots coming off the cordon and all that kind of stuff. And it just gets very, very bushy. And this wasn't part of the study or anything like that. But when I cane prune Marquette, I felt that the fruit was getting better sun exposure on it because we have fewer of those non-count shoots coming off of that cordon. It was a consistently highest yielding of those options, but again, that's a completely different pruning system that, again, you may not want to adopt or mess with. And if you skirt your vines, you shorten those options of what you can prune to for the winter. So you're not going to be able to skirt your vines much if you're cane pruning and your vines are spaced 8 feet apart. Again, the 2-note spurs were below average. 3 to 5-note spurs were average to above average yield. So again, if I'm personally producing Marquette, I'm going to probably prune to 3 to 5-note spurs, not 2-note spurs for me. And the last one is La Crescent. And it's a little bit different story. So 2023, we averaged about 21 pounds per vine. And in this situation, the cane prune vines did the worst. Now, these are also in a VSP training system. The other ones are high wire. So that could be part of the reason for that. But if you looked, the 4 and 5-note spurs were above average in terms of yield. The 2 and 3-note spurs are about average. And we did it again in 2024. Our yields are a lot lower this in 2024, which I know a lot of other growers had that situation. And the cane prune vines, the 2-node spur vines did the worst. The 5-node spur vines are about average, and the 3 to 4-node spurred vines were above average. So again, my takeaway, I would avoid cane pruning La Crescent. Again, it could be, part of that could be due to the VSP training system where those shoots tend to be a little more shade. And I wouldn't personally prune them to 2-node spurs unless my vines are low in vigor. If they're low in vigor, that makes a whole lot of sense. If they're high in vigor, we might consider using longer spurs. Now, there are some problems with long spurs, and I'll talk about that here in a little bit. So I just said this a little bit ago. So again, cane pruning, consistently lower yield, 2-node spurs, below average to average yield, 3 to 5-node spurs were at least average to above average yield. So negatives of long spurs. There are some definite negatives. Number one, if you have a VSP training system, that fruit and those shoots get higher up on that trellis. And if you hedge, that creates some problems. The other negative to long spurs, you're leaving fewer long spurs, which means if you choose a bad spur, it makes a huge difference because it's a high percentage of those spurs you're leaving in the canopy. And it means you're leaving fewer spur positions in that vine. And so I'd still leave, renewal spurs every so often. But there's some negatives. High wire, there's some negatives too. That fruit isn't as close to the cordon if we leave long spurs. I also noticed some breakage, especially with Brianna. I had to leave some thinner canes than ideal, and those clusters are pretty heavy. And so on those 5-node spurs, those long spurs, we did have some breakage on them. And so that probably affected the yield a little bit. The other varieties, I did not see that. But especially with Brianna as well, those nodes are quite far apart. So that fruit gets pretty low in the canopy with really long spurs. That there are some negatives to that as well. So again, my personal takeaway is if I were pruning these varieties, I would probably not personally prune them on a mature vine to anything less than 3-node spurs. And if I have high vigor vine, I would probably consider a 4-node spur. In some situations, maybe a 5-node. But again, there are some drawbacks to that. So I'm going to skip over the mechanical pruning thing, but I do think as labor gets tighter, this is going to becoming a more likely thing of the future, and not as sole pruning, but maybe a mechanical pre-pruner. And it's never going to look like hand pruning like the top is, and this isn't my best hand pruning, but the bottom is full mechanical pruning. And the spur length discussion we just had here still is impacted by, how high we leave those cutters and so forth. But personally, I would still do some hand follow-up. And there's some people that have implemented the system in other parts of the country, and their mechanical pruning with hand follow-up is a lot cleaner than this is. But I do think as labor gets tighter and then, coming years, decades, what have you, mechanical pre-pruning is probably going to be more of a norm. So as I kind of wrap up here, so I got a SARE grant to do this project. So I'd like to thank them, and we will open this up to any discussion.